The first bullet entered his shoulder before he finished saying his own name. Marcus Delane was 53 years old, a retired postal worker from Decatur, Illinois, driving home from his daughter's house in Champaign on a Tuesday night in March. He'd stayed late helping her assemble a crib for her first baby, his first grandchild, a girl they were going to name after his late wife, Patricia. The roads were empty. The cornfields stretched black on either side of Route 47. He was doing 54 in a 55 zone because that was the kind of man Marcus Delane had always been. Careful, deliberate, a man who never gave anyone a reason to look twice at him. Deputy Aaron Vance pulled him over at 11:47 p.m. The dashcam showed Marcus signaling, slowing, pulling onto the gravel shoulder with both hands visible on the steering wheel. It showed Deputy Vance approaching the driver's side window with his flashlight up. It showed conversation. It showed Marcus reaching toward his glove compartment. And then the dashcam showed nothing at all, because someone had switched it off. The official report would later say Marcus Delane lunged for a weapon. The official report would say Deputy Vance feared for his life. The official report would describe a struggle that lasted 90 seconds and ended with Marcus Delane face down on cold gravel, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds, one in his shoulder and one in his lower back, while the deputy radioed for backup with a voice so calm you'd think he was ordering coffee. But there was another camera that night. Marcus Delane had installed a small recording device on his dashboard 3 years earlier, after a different traffic stop in a different county had left him shaking for hours. Nothing happened that time, just questions that felt wrong, hands on his car that lingered too long, a flashlight beam that seemed to search for something it wanted to find. His wife had still been alive then, and she'd asked him why he needed a camera, and he'd told her the truth, because nobody was going to believe him if something ever went wrong. Nobody was going to take his word over a badge. Patricia had cried that night, not because she was scared for him, because she knew he was right. The personal dashcam Marcus installed was small, battery-powered, and automatic. It started recording the moment the car's engine turned over and didn't stop until 30 minutes after ignition cut. It saved everything to a micro SD card he kept in a fireproof box behind the passenger seat. Deputy Vance never found it. The footage it captured that night would eventually be seen by 12 million people, but not before Marcus Delane spent 47 days in a hospital bed, handcuffed to the rail, charged with assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest with force likely to cause great bodily harm. His daughter Keisha first saw him 4 days after the shooting. The hospital in Champaign had initially refused her entry because Marcus was classified as a violent offender in custody. She called every lawyer she could find. She called the ACLU. She called 3 news stations, and none of them called her back. On day 5, a nurse named Donna Harkness broke protocol and let Keisha into the room for 11 minutes while the deputy stationed outside took a bathroom break. What Keisha saw was her father unconscious, his left arm shackled to the bed, his shoulder wrapped in bandages already browning with old blood, and a catheter bag that looked like it hadn't been changed in days. She took photographs. She nearly got arrested for it. The first lawyer who agreed to take the case was a woman named Sandra Okonkwo, 51 years old, running a 2-person practice out of a converted house in downtown Decatur. She specialized in employment discrimination and small civil claims. She had never handled a police shooting, but she knew Marcus Delane personally. He delivered mail to her office for 16 years before he retired. He always remembered her birthday. He always asked about her mother. When Keisha showed her the photographs from the hospital, Sandra didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked one question. "Did your father keep any records?" Keisha remembered the fireproof box. She remembered her father mentioning it once, casually, the way he mentioned everything, like it was just common sense. She drove to the impound lot where the Champaign County Sheriff's Department had taken her father's car, and she was told she couldn't access it because it was evidence in an ongoing investigation. So she hired a private investigator named Dale Compton, 63 years old, a former state trooper from Effingham who'd quit the force in 1994 after refusing to cover for a partner who'd beaten a suspect. Dale had spent the last 3 decades taking cases nobody wanted and finding evidence nobody thought existed. He charged Keisha half his usual rate because he'd heard the name Marcus Delane before. They went to the same church, years ago, before Dale stopped going to church at all. Dale knew people at the impound lot. He knew which shift supervisor owed him a favor. He got into that car at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, with a flashlight and 12 minutes before anyone noticed. The fireproof box was still there. The SD card was inside. Dale watched the footage in his truck, parked outside a gas station in Farmer City, and when it was over, he pulled onto the shoulder and sat there for 20 minutes with his hands on the wheel, just trying to remember how to breathe. The footage showed everything. It showed Deputy Vance approaching the window. It showed Marcus rolling down the glass, saying good evening, asking what seemed to be the problem. It showed the deputy asking for license and registration, and Marcus saying yes, sir, reaching slowly toward the glove compartment, narrating his movements out loud. I'm opening the glove box now. My registration is inside. I'm going to hand it to you. It showed Deputy Vance saying stop. It showed Marcus stopping. It showed Deputy Vance leaning into the window and saying, I know you. You live off Jasper Road, don't you? Marcus said no. He said he lived on Maple Street in Decatur, always had. Deputy Vance said that's interesting, because I know a man who lives off Jasper Road who looks exactly like you, and that man has been causing problems. Marcus said, I don't know what you mean. Deputy Vance said step out of the vehicle. Marcus asked why. The footage showed the door being yanked open. It showed Marcus being pulled out by his jacket collar, losing his balance on the gravel, going to his knees. It showed him raising his hands, saying, I'm not resisting, I'm not resisting. It showed Deputy Vance drawing his weapon. It showed Marcus looking up at the gun and saying, please. And it showed Deputy Vance firing twice without a single word of warning, from 4 feet away, at a man who was kneeling in the dark with his hands in the air. Then it showed Deputy Vance walking back to his patrol car, reaching inside and pressing something on the dashboard. His official camera went dark right then. He didn't know about the other one. He rolled Marcus onto his stomach, put a knee on his back, and radioed dispatch. Shots fired, suspect armed and dangerous. Officer needs assistance. Marcus was not armed. There was no weapon in his car. There was no weapon on his person. The only thing in his glove compartment was a registration document and an old photograph of Patricia from their wedding day that Marcus kept there because he liked to see her face every time he opened it. That photograph had blood on it when the evidence technicians logged it. Nobody ever explained how. Sandra Okonkwo received the footage from Dale Compton on a Thursday morning. By Thursday night, she had driven to Chicago and hand-delivered a copy to Marion Schaefer, a civil rights attorney at one of the largest firms in the state, a woman who had won 3 federal lawsuits against police departments in the last decade and never lost one. Marion watched the footage at 11 p.m. in her office on the 32nd floor of a building overlooking the lake. When it ended, she turned to Sandra and said 2 words. We file tomorrow. The lawsuit named Deputy Aaron Vance, Sheriff Gerald Traynor of Champaign County, and the county itself. It alleged excessive force, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, falsification of official reports, and deliberate indifference to medical needs. It demanded $14 million in damages. It also demanded something money couldn't buy. It demanded the criminal charges against Marcus Delane be dropped, and it demanded the footage be released to the public. Sheriff Traynor held a press conference the day the lawsuit was filed. He stood at a podium with his deputies behind him and said his department was committed to transparency and accountability. He said Deputy Vance had acted in accordance with his training. He said the footage being circulated by the plaintiff's attorneys was incomplete and lacked context. He said Marcus Delane had made threatening statements during the traffic stop. He said Marcus Delane had reached for Deputy Vance's service weapon. He said his department stood by its officer. And then a reporter from the Chicago Tribune asked if the sheriff had actually watched the plaintiff's footage. Sheriff Traynor said he had no comment on pending litigation. The footage leaked 3 days later. Nobody ever proved who did it. Marion Schaefer certainly never admitted to anything. But by the weekend, it was everywhere. Every news network, every website, every phone in America, it seemed. Marcus Delane, still in a hospital bed, still handcuffed, still facing felony charges, watched himself get shot on his daughter's phone and didn't say a word. Keisha said later that he just closed his eyes and nodded, like he'd expected it all along. Like he'd always known this was how the story would go. The Champaign County State's attorney dropped the charges against Marcus on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the footage went public. No press conference, no apology, just a one-paragraph statement saying the charges were being dismissed in the interest of justice. Marcus was released from the hospital 6 days later. He still couldn't lift his left arm above his head. He still needed a cane to walk because the bullet that entered his lower back had grazed his spine. Doctors said the nerve damage might heal, or it might not. There was no way to know. His physical therapist, a young woman named Christine Royer, told him later that she cried in the supply closet after his first session because he never complained. Not once. He just did the exercises, gritted his teeth, and thanked her when it was over. The civil trial was scheduled for September, but Deputy Aaron Vance never made it to the courtroom. On August 2nd, 5 weeks before trial, Dale Compton delivered a second piece of evidence to Sandra Okonkwo. He'd been digging through Deputy Vance's personnel file, obtained through a public records request that took 4 months and 3 court orders to enforce. What he found changed everything. Aaron Vance had been involved in 4 previous use-of-force incidents over his 11-year career. 3 of them involved black men pulled over on rural highways late at night. All 3 had been investigated and cleared. All 3 investigations lasted less than 48 hours. But the 4th incident was different. 6 years earlier, in 2017, Deputy Vance had responded to a domestic disturbance call in a town called Ogden, about 20 miles east of Champaign. The call came from a woman named Ruth Hadley, who said her ex-husband was on her porch and wouldn't leave. When Deputy Vance arrived, the ex-husband was gone. Ruth Hadley was alone, standing in her doorway with a phone in her hand. What happened next was never fully documented. The incident report said Deputy Vance conducted a welfare check and left after confirming the subject had departed. But Ruth Hadley filed a complaint the next day, saying Deputy Vance had entered her home without permission, searched her bedroom, and made comments about her body that left her shaking for hours. The complaint was marked unfounded. Ruth Hadley was advised to contact the sheriff's department if she experienced further issues. 3 months later, Ruth Hadley was found dead in her car, parked on a gravel road 6 miles from her home. The coroner ruled it a suicide. Single gunshot wound to the head. No note. No witnesses. Her mother, a woman named Dolores Grant, had never believed it. She'd spent 5 years writing letters to every agency she could think of, demanding a new investigation, demanding someone look at Deputy Vance, demanding someone explain why her daughter would drive 6 miles from home to die on a road she had no reason to be on. Nobody ever wrote back. Dale Compton found Dolores Grant living in a nursing home in Danville, 81 years old, still sharp, still angry. She told him everything. She showed him the letters. She showed him photographs of her daughter. She showed him the complaint Ruth had filed, which she'd kept a copy of because she never trusted police to keep their own records. And she told Dale something he hadn't expected. Ruth had mentioned a man who looked like Deputy Vance once before, months before the domestic call. She'd been pulled over on Route 47, late at night, driving home from a friend's house. The deputy who stopped her had asked strange questions. "Where do you live? Who's at home with you? Is there anyone expecting you tonight?" Ruth had been frightened enough to call her mother from the car after he let her go. Dolers still remembered the conversation. "He kept shining his light on my face," Ruth had said, "like he was trying to memorize me." The man Ruth described was younger then, but the location was the same. The time of night was the same. The questions were the same. And Route 47, it turned out, had a history. Dale dug deeper. He requested traffic stop records from Champaign County going back 15 years. The data was incomplete, redacted in places, but patterns emerged. Deputy Vance had logged more traffic stops on Route 47 between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. than any other officer in the department, by a factor of 3. Most of those stops never resulted in citations. Most of them lasted less than 10 minutes. Most of them involved single drivers, and most of them were never mentioned again. Until Dale started finding the drivers. He found 11 of them, 6 women, 5 men. All of them had been stopped by Deputy Vance on Route 47 over the last decade. All of them described the same thing: the strange questions, the flashlight on the face, the feeling of being studied, cataloged, filed away for later. 2 of them had been stopped more than once, months apart, by the same deputy on the same stretch of road. Both times, they were told they matched the description of someone causing problems in the area. Both times, they were let go with a warning. Neither could explain what they'd been warned about. Sandra Okonkwo presented this evidence to Marion Schaefer on a humid afternoon in late August. The trial was 3 weeks away. They were supposed to be preparing their closing arguments. Instead, they were staring at a map of Route 47 covered in pushpins, each one marking a stop, a complaint, a question nobody had thought to ask until now. "He was hunting," Marion said. Sandra didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They amended the lawsuit. They added Ruth Hadley's name. They added every driver Dale Compton had found. They called it a pattern of predatory policing, and they asked the court to unseal Deputy Vance's complete personnel file, including any complaints or investigations that had been expunged or hidden from public view. The motion was filed on a Friday. By Monday, the county had offered to settle. The number was $8.4 million. The terms included a formal apology from Sheriff Traynor, the immediate termination of Deputy Aaron Vance, and a consent decree requiring the department to implement new oversight measures, including mandatory retention of all dashcam footage for a minimum of 5 years. Marcus Delane said no. He said it in a conference room in Chicago, surrounded by lawyers who couldn't understand why. $8 million was more money than he'd ever see in 3 lifetimes. The apology was public, binding, humiliating for the sheriff. The consent decree would change how the department operated for a generation. But Marcus wanted something else. He wanted Aaron Vance arrested. He wanted criminal charges. He wanted a jury to look at that footage and say out loud what everyone watching already knew. This was not a mistake. This was not excessive force. This was attempted murder. Marion explained that criminal charges were outside the scope of civil litigation. She explained that the state's attorney had sole discretion over whether to prosecute. She explained that political pressure might help, but there were no guarantees, no levers they could pull that would force a prosecution. Marcus listened, then he asked one question. "If I take this money and go home, does Aaron Vance spend a single night in jail?" Nobody answered. "Then we go to trial," Marcus said. The trial lasted 9 days. Deputy Aaron Vance took the stand on day 4. He sat in the witness box in a gray suit that didn't fit well, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere above the jury's heads. He answered every question in the same flat tone, never raising his voice, never showing emotion. Yes, he had stopped Marcus Delane on Route 47. Yes, he had asked him to step out of the vehicle. Yes, he had discharged his weapon. But he maintained, under oath, that Marcus had reached for something in his waistband. He maintained that he had feared for his life. He maintained that the footage, which had been played for the jury 3 times by then, did not show what it appeared to show. Marion Schaefer cross-examined him for 4 hours. She asked about Ruth Hadley. He said he didn't remember her. She asked about the other traffic stops. He said they were routine. She asked about the dashcam that went dark. He said it malfunctioned. She asked him to point to the exact moment on the footage where Marcus Delane reached for a weapon. He couldn't. She asked him to explain how a man kneeling on gravel with his hands in the air posed an imminent threat. He said you had to be there. She asked him if he'd ever told anyone before that night that he knew a man on Jasper Road who looked exactly like Marcus Delane. He said he didn't recall. She showed him the county records. There was no Jasper Road in Champaign County. There never had been. Deputy Vance didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at that spot above the jury's heads, like he was waiting for the question to go away. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found for the plaintiff on every count. They awarded Marcus Delane $11.3 million in compensatory and punitive damages. They found that Deputy Aaron Vance had acted with deliberate indifference to Marcus Delane's constitutional rights. They found that Sheriff Gerald Traynor had failed to properly supervise his deputy despite clear warning signs. They found that Champaign County had maintained policies and practices that enabled the violation. The verdict was read on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus sat in the gallery with his daughter beside him, his cane leaning against the bench, his left hand trembling the way it always did now. When the foreperson said the word liable, Keisha grabbed his arm and squeezed so hard he winced. When the foreperson read the damages, the courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Someone in the back started clapping. Marcus just closed his eyes. Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, the press swarmed him. Microphones were shoved in his face. Voices overlapped, asking how he felt, what this meant, what he wanted to say to Deputy Vance. Marcus waited until the noise died down. Then he spoke. "I didn't want this money," he said. "I wanted to hold my granddaughter without my arm shaking. I wanted to walk my daughter down the aisle at her wedding without needing a cane. I wanted to go one night without waking up and seeing that gun in my face." He paused. The cameras kept rolling. "But I'll take this money, and I'll use it to make sure no one else has to go through what I went through, not on Route 47, not anywhere." He didn't take questions. He just turned and walked down the steps, slowly, carefully, leaning on that cane like it was the only thing holding him up. 3 months after the verdict, the Illinois Attorney General announced that a special prosecutor would be appointed to investigate Deputy Aaron Vance for potential criminal charges, including aggravated battery with a firearm and official misconduct. The investigation was prompted by what the AG's office called substantial public interest and new evidence presented during civil proceedings. Deputy Vance was indicted 6 months later. The trial was set for the following spring. But Aaron Vance never stood before a criminal jury. On the night before his arraignment, he drove out to Route 47 in his personal vehicle, parked on the same gravel shoulder where he'd shot Marcus Delane, and sat there until morning. A passing trucker found him at 6 a.m., slumped against the steering wheel, unresponsive. Empty bottle of whiskey on the passenger seat, empty bottle of pills on the floor. He left no note. He left no explanation. He left nothing but a personnel file full of complaints nobody had followed up on, and a stretch of highway full of people who still didn't know why they'd been stopped. Marcus Delane heard the news from his daughter, who'd heard it from Sandra Okonkwo. He was sitting on his porch in Decatur, watching his granddaughter sleep in a bassinet beside him. Patricia Marie Delane, 3 months old, named for the woman who had known this day would come. Keisha asked her father how he felt. Marcus looked at the baby for a long time. Then he looked out at the street, at the mailboxes he'd filled for 30 years, at the neighbors he'd waved to every morning, at the life he'd built one careful step at a time. "I feel tired," he said. Keisha sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stayed there, watching her daughter sleep, listening to the wind move through the trees. After a while, Marcus spoke again. "He drove all the way out there," he said, "to that exact spot, in the middle of the night. Why do you think he did that?" Keisha shook her head. "I don't know, Daddy." Marcus nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "Maybe he wanted to see it one more time," he said. "That road, that darkness. Maybe he wanted to remember what it felt like, to have all that power, to point a gun at someone and know there wasn't a thing they could do about it." He looked at his granddaughter again, at her tiny hands, at her closed eyes, at her face that looked so much like Patricia it made his chest ache. "Or maybe," Marcus said, "he just wanted to know what it felt like, to be the one who couldn't get away." The baby stirred in her sleep. Marcus reached out and touched her hand with one trembling finger. She wrapped her tiny fist around it without waking. "I guess we'll never know," Keisha said. Marcus didn't respond. He just sat there, holding his granddaughter's hand, staring out at a street that looked exactly the same as it always had. But the world was different now, and so was he. 2 years later, the state of Illinois passed the Marcus Delane Act, requiring all law enforcement vehicles to be equipped with tamper-proof recording systems that could not be deactivated by officers in the field. The footage would be automatically uploaded to secure servers controlled by an independent oversight board. Any officer found to have interfered with recording equipment would face immediate suspension and potential criminal charges. Marcus testified before the state legislature on the day the bill was signed. He sat at a long table, facing a room full of lawmakers and cameras, his cane leaning against his chair, his left arm still not quite right, probably never would be. He didn't talk about the shooting. He didn't talk about the trial. He didn't talk about the money, which he'd used to set up a foundation in his wife's name, funding legal aid for people who couldn't afford lawyers when the system came for them. He talked about the dashcam he'd bought with his own money 3 years before that night on Route 47. He talked about why he'd bought it. He talked about the conversation he'd had with Patricia, the night she cried, the night they both understood something neither of them wanted to say out loud. "I knew," Marcus said. "I knew that if something ever happened to me out there on some dark road in the middle of the night with nobody watching, my word wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't matter what I said. It wouldn't matter who I was. It wouldn't matter that I'd spent 30 years carrying mail through heat and snow and everything in between, never missing a day, never causing trouble, never giving anyone a reason." He paused. The room was silent. "My word wouldn't be enough," he said again, "because I knew how this country works. I knew what I looked like to a man with a badge and a gun and the whole night to himself. I knew what Ruth Hadley looked like. I knew what all those other folks looked like, the ones who got stopped on that road and told they matched a description and were sent home shaking. We all knew." He looked down at his hands. The tremor was barely visible now, but it was still there. "Patricia used to ask me why I didn't trust people," he said. "She was always the optimist, always believed things would get better. She'd say, 'Marcus, you can't live your whole life expecting the worst.' And I'd tell her I wasn't expecting the worst. I was just preparing for it. Because in this country, for people who look like me, preparing for the worst is the only way to survive it." He lifted his head. He looked directly at the lawmakers, one by one. This bill won't fix everything, I know that. There's going to be another Aaron Vance out there somewhere right now doing the same thing he did to me, to Ruth, to all those people on all those dark roads, and no law is going to stop him, not completely, not forever. He leaned forward. But maybe this bill will catch him. Maybe this bill will make sure the camera keeps running when he reaches for his gun. Maybe this bill will give somebody somewhere the evidence they need to prove what happened, to prove they didn't reach for a weapon, to prove they were on their knees with their hands up, saying please. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. That's all I wanted, he said. That's all any of us have ever wanted, to be believed, to have our truth count for something, to know that when we say this is what happened, somebody somewhere will look at the tape and say, yes, it did. He sat back. That's not justice, he said. Not really. Justice would be Patricia meeting her granddaughter. Justice would be Ruth Hadley still being alive. Justice would be me being able to lift my arm over my head without it feeling like fire. He shook his head. But it's something, it's a start, and I guess after everything that's all you can ask for. The bill passed unanimously, both parties every vote. Marcus was there for the signing ceremony, standing behind the governor, his cane in one hand and his granddaughter in the other. Keisha had wanted to hold Patricia, but Marcus had insisted. He wanted her there. He wanted her to see it even if she wouldn't remember, especially because she wouldn't remember. Someone snapped a photograph at the moment the governor signed. It became one of those images that circulates forever, reproduced in textbooks and documentaries and anniversary articles. Marcus Delane, 70 pounds lighter than he'd been before the shooting, his left arm still not working quite right, holding a 2-year-old girl in a yellow dress, both of them looking at the camera with the same expression. Not smiling, not triumphant, just looking. Like they were waiting for something, like they knew this wasn't the end. Keisha framed that photograph and put it on her father's mantle, next to the wedding picture of him and Patricia. Marcus didn't talk about it. He never talked about any of it, really, not after that day at the legislature. He just went back to his life, such as it was. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Foundation meetings once a month. Long walks through the neighborhood with his cane, waving at the neighbors, pretending his shoulder didn't ache. He died in his sleep 4 years later, at 61, of a heart attack the doctors said was probably connected to the stress his body had endured. Keisha found him in the morning, sitting up in bed with a book open on his lap. A mystery novel Patricia had given him 20 years earlier, one he'd read a dozen times. The funeral was small. Marcus had never wanted a spectacle, but the church was full anyway. Mail carriers he'd worked with, lawyers who'd fought for him, strangers who'd watched the footage and never forgotten. Dolores Grant came, 90 years old, pushed in a wheelchair by a grandson she barely recognized most days. She sat in the front row and didn't speak to anyone, but when Keisha walked by after the service, Dolores reached out and grabbed her hand. He didn't forget her, Dolores said. Her voice was thin, barely audible. Ruth, he didn't forget. Keisha nodded. She didn't know what to say. Nobody forgot, Dolores said. That's what matters. Nobody forgot. The old woman let go of her hand and closed her eyes. Her grandson wheeled her away. That night after the reception, after the casseroles and the condolences, Keisha sat alone on her father's porch. Patricia Marie, 6 years old now, was asleep inside. The street was quiet. The moon was full. Keisha thought about what her father had said all those years ago, outside the courthouse. About wanting to hold his granddaughter without his arm shaking. About wanting to walk her down the aisle without a cane. He'd never gotten either. The shaking never stopped. The cane was with him until the end. But he'd held Patricia every single day. He'd read her stories and taught her songs and let her paint his fingernails purple because she thought it was hilarious. He'd watched her take her first steps and say her first words and start kindergarten last fall, proud as any grandfather had ever been. And he'd made sure, before he died, that every officer in the state of Illinois would have to think twice before reaching for that button, before shutting off the camera, before deciding that what happened next would be their word against someone else's. That wasn't everything. It wasn't justice, not really. But it was something. Keisha looked out at the street, at the houses where her father had delivered mail for 30 years, at the sidewalk where he'd learned to walk again after the shooting, at the world that looked exactly the same as it always had but wasn't, not anymore. And she thought about Route 47, that dark stretch of highway where everything had happened, where Deputy Vance had pulled over her father and asked him to step out of the car, where he'd fired those 2 shots into a man who was kneeling with his hands in the air. She'd driven out there once a year after the trial, just to see it, just to understand. There was nothing special about it, just a road, just cornfields, just gravel on the shoulder and darkness stretching out in every direction. But she'd stood there for a long time anyway, trying to imagine what her father had seen in those last seconds before the gun went off. The stars, the flashlight, the face of a man who had already decided what was going to happen. And she'd wondered, as she stood there, how many other people had seen the same thing. How many other nights had ended on that same shoulder, with the same questions, the same fear, the same desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. She'd never know, nobody would, that was the point. But her father had survived. He'd kept the camera running. He'd made sure the truth got out. And maybe somewhere on some other dark road, someone else was doing the same thing, installing their own camera, keeping their own records, preparing for the worst because they knew, like Marcus knew, that their word would never be enough. That was the world they lived in. That was the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. But Keisha said it anyway, standing on her father's porch, looking up at the same moon that had been shining over Route 47 the night he almost died. "He saw me," she whispered, "and he shot anyway." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went silent. And Keisha Delane sat there until morning, thinking about cameras and truth and a father who had spent his whole life being careful, being deliberate, never giving anyone a reason. And still,